the work session. Good to see everybody. I don't have anything really for us other than just to get started. I don't know if we were going to have public comment. I don't see a lot of people gathered here for non-agenda items. I'm going to check though. I'm not seeing anybody. I anticipated that we might have a few guests with us this evening, but I don't see anybody, so I think we better just get to it. Everybody okay with that? All right. Well, we have your documents. I think this might be one of those work sessions that you want to have that stuff ready to refer back to if you want. And I don't really have a identified staff person on the agenda, so I'm not really sure who to hand it over to. That's part of my hesitation here, folks. So I'll just turn it over to Janine Jordan, the city manager.
Good evening. Thank you, Mayor. I'll kind of kick off here. We have prepared a presentation for you this evening that will kind of touch on the housing trends and challenges that we have been seeing in the community over the last number of years, as you know. And I did email the council a number of weeks ago, drawing your attention to the documents and the data that we have compiled in recent years to help us wrap our head around and understand the trends and challenges, and ultimately with the goal to help us figure out how the city as a government, local government entity might be able to work to address the housing crunch, I guess, that we have here in the community. So you received that email. We talked about our Thrive housing page. We talked about the Community Economic Development Plan, our Thrive Plan, the Albany County Housing Report prepared by the Wyoming Business Council, and then finally our Housing Study and Action Plan. We're going to touch on each of those just very briefly tonight. Derek Taney, our planning manager, is going to do this presentation with me. And I think what we'll do is at the end of each discrete section, those 4 sections of data and reports we've compiled, we'll stop and allow for questions. I will let you know that we're building, of course, in the presentation ultimately toward at the end, giving the council an opportunity to weigh in on where you might like to focus your efforts moving forward. So that part of the discussion we can maybe save to the last slide or two. The other thing that I'll mention is that we do expect this to be the first of at least 2 and maybe 3 work sessions. This one being the work session where we just revisit the work we've done in recent years. At the end of the presentation, seeking direction from you on what you'd like us to come back with in early August as far as potential solutions and strategies. So that's kind of the plan for tonight. I think the presentation is about 30, 40 minutes long. With that, I would invite our planning manager, Derek Taney, to take the next couple of slides. Thank you.
That's great. Yeah. Hi, Derek.
Hello, Council. Let's see. You should all see the presentation now kind of up on your screen. Okay. So as Janine noted, we're going to be really kind of trying to provide that baseline for housing in Laramie. From a staff perspective and from a perspective of the community, there's been a lot of work done related to housing kind of leading up to this point. And so I think as we, go through this presentation, asking questions and things like that, we really want you to get away to come from this presentation with a good understanding of kind of where we stand today. And then as Janine kind of noted it and we'll address in this later slides is really what kind of direction do we want to take? Janine's heard me say it many, many times. Laramie doesn't have a silver bullet when it comes to solving housing. We are not that fortunate. We're going to have a multifaceted approach to really taking housing on in Laramie if we're going to be serious about it. And so this is really the foundational discussion related to that. And then as we've noted, there's probably going to be other work sessions we're going to have before we get to that point where we really start churning out code changes, addressing this more head on from a council, planning commission, community direction. So really with that, what we're going to do with this presentation is we're going to go through our kind of housing today. Where are we at, and provide you then with kind of a Laramie overview. And we're going to keep this brief. We're not going to dig into the weeds too hard on this today, but probably in future meetings, we probably will need to do that. Then we're going to really look at the 2015 housing study. Remember, that housing study laid the data foundation for what we're talking about today. This shows you the numbers, the analysis of kind of where we were at 5 years ago and kind of where we stand today. We then have just our kind of economic development aspect of housing. How does housing play a role in our economic development, both, locally and at the state level, but what is the information telling us? What is the state telling us about our housing? What is our local economic analysis telling about our housing? And then we're going to jump into our kind of 2020 work that we've been doing with community builders and the strategy that we put together through that process. And then we're going to kind of end with some of our code audit work that we did in conjunction with community builders that is taking a look at that, just one segment of the housing kind of components of the different ways in which we may want to attack housing in Laramie and trying to provide a positive, approach to housing. And so with that, where are we at with housing today? What we're seeing globally, regionally, nationally is that we're seeing a lot of societal changes that are affecting housing. And with that, Laramie isn't any different. We're seeing those same housing challenges that many other communities are seeing. And so right now, you have the Rocky Mountain West, which is the fastest growing region in the United States. And with that comes housing strain. It comes, housing price increases, supply and demand issues. And what communities are finding is that when housing is unaffordable, it's tough for the working people. It's tough for the majority of your kind of community members who are not at the highest end and not at the lowest end, but are in the middle. And when you start to have that strain, it becomes difficult for communities to really grow. It becomes difficult for businesses to grow. Your economy suffers. And honestly, what you start to have is a lower quality of life within your community. And so housing, really plays a large role in a lot of other aspects beyond just physically having a place to rest your head, having a place to go after you get done with work. And so having a healthy housing economy within your community is important for a lot of reasons. So kind of building on that principle and just that discussion, I want you to take a look at the figure here that we've got. You will probably see this figure again. And what we tried to show with this in more of a visual representation is where does housing land in terms of things that it affects, things that it impacts, both good and bad. Housing, as I was just kind of mentioning, quality of life is impacted by housing. And so as we started to put this figure together as staff, we really started realizing that probably between a lot of these different set areas that we note here, such as housing affordability or the state of Wyoming legal restrictions or economic demand and economic supply, a lot of these are all tied together. You'll see some of the same bubbles in some of the same areas. And so, I just want to point out, as we're nearing the end, hopefully, of this pandemic, we're seeing major shifts in how housing and what people desire and where people want to live. The way in which we work is different. When you start looking at things like land within our community, you see how zoning affects property. You see that the cost of land can affect housing, the availability, what types of zoning districts you have, the cost of infrastructure. Then you start looking at things like the economic demand. Business recruitment housing and business recruitment go hand in hand. If you don't have a place to put new business employees, why would a business want to come to your community? And then with that, you start to see some of the things that, we've talked about, such as in our economic development plan, like brain drain. And then how does that tie to things like the university and Wyotech and LCCC? So the complexity of this diagram is, could probably be even more complex than what we're showing here. But what we're trying to just display is that housing isn't a singular issue. It's not just we provide more housing and it solves the problems that we're talking about, but that really there's a lot of aspects of housing that some are tied to the city of Laramie. So us as a municipality, us as a council, as a governing body, but also some of these things are very much out of our control. Things like COVID, for instance, completely out of our control. Sometimes the decisions made maybe at the state level, such as restricting affordable housing incentives. And then also you have things like, if there's only so many people to build a house, it doesn't matter what regulations potentially we change here at a local level, but if there's only so many people to swing the hammer, we can only get so many units built in a certain amount of time. And so we really felt that this figure, as we started putting it together, was a great way to display that interconnectedness of all the different aspects of how housing relates in sometimes good and bad ways. So the next thing I really want to jump into is really the 2015 housing study. And I'm going to say for council, as well as any of the members of the public that are on this this work session tonight, is if you haven't seen and read this document is very data heavy, but it's stacked with really valuable information to give you the real raw numbers related to housing. It was a 15-year plan that was done by our housing consultants, and they really focused on really what do we need in terms of housing in the next 15 years, so through 2030. If you take any number away, take the number, we need 4,106 units of housing by 2030. It's 2020 already. We're 5 years in, and we're not on pace. Okay, I can let you know that. So really, what was found in the plan. So very briefly, there was main goals within the plan. You'll see these main goals that I've listed in this presentation. I'm not going to go through except point out some of the real high points here. So one, how do we develop and encourage housing? So by 2020, we needed 1,538 units. We did not get there. That's 630 owner occupied and 898 rental units. Half of those units we needed for 55 and older population group, essentially. We also really desired through this plan to look at potential housing partnerships. And really, in order to try to encourage and monitor this housing development, our consultants felt that potentially a staff position was needed to really focus in on this issue for Laramie, and that was 5 years ago. So the second goal out of this plan was new housing variety. You'll hear a little bit later in our presentation about how do we provide a mix of housing or different typologies of housing. That's kind of what we're talking about. We're going to be looking at, how do we provide housing that meets different income levels, different desires. So different numbers of bedrooms, housing for family, housing for seniors, housing for your young professional. All those things are really focused on in this kind of goal or really direction in this plan. Goal 3 was preservation of existing owner and rental housing stock. Really one of the things that came out in this study, as well as it's come out in future studies, some of the quality is to be desired. rental and housing stock, owner housing stock in general. So how do we encourage rehab? How do we encourage remodels? How do we still preserve some of the history? And then do we have to look at things like inspections, rental inspection, rental registry? The fourth goal in the plan was, how do we finance housing development? And one, seeking state and federal funds. There are options out there for both private and public investment. Things such as supporting tax increment financing was also really important. To not dig too far into that. Right now, it's very difficult, and it's not very easy for state of Wyoming people to use tax increment financing to fund these projects, which is a common way in which other states do fund these types of projects. And then maybe how do we create housing incentives? How do we, provide that carrot for good housing development and housing development that the community needs? Goal 5 was reducing barriers to fair housing. How do we create more of a community effort, public-private partnerships? How do we address rent quality, landlord-renter relationships, those things that create a positive environment for housing, no matter if you're owning or renting? And do we establish fair housing policies within our community to ensure that we're seeing equitable housing options for everyone, and not just for select few or people that have maybe an economic status that can afford things, that allow them choice, for instance. You'll see in Goal 6, fairly straightforward and potential rental registry or inspection process, a way in which we can control and monitor really what is our housing, especially in that rental stock area. And then goal number 7, enhancing mobile home parks. One, only permitting HUD homes and mobile homes of certain ages, permissions of RV space conversions, and aesthetic improvements and park inspections. I can say this is one area in which we did adopt regulations shortly after the adoption of this plan that kind of took the first steps, I would say, in improving some of our mobile home parks in terms of aesthetics, junk, weeds, nuisance things, also as well as basic life, health, safety items such as ensuring proper skirting, numbering for our law enforcement and for our emergency response teams as well. So if you remember, yeah.
I'm sorry. Could you note on those last 2 slides the green text? Or just mention to council why it's green, I guess.
Yeah, so you'll see throughout kind of this presentation some of the green text kind of as areas that, as from a staff perspective, that we think we can start to really have profitable conversations about in terms of addressing some of our housing needs in these areas. You'll see that also with some of the green text, some of these things we've done some things about. So we've actually accomplished items. So for instance, like in goal 1, housing 55 years and older. If you recall, we've sold land to senior housing projects to help accommodate that need for housing specifically geared, for instance, to 55 and older. Also, as we kind of go through like goal 2, low, moderate income units, we've worked with other projects, where people have done affordable housing. We've had some rental registry inspection work sessions. I think, what was that, about 8 months ago now. And so as we go through this presentation, you'll see some of those kind of green highlighted areas. So definitely kind of pay attention to those, because as we get to the end of the presentation and really start talking about direction, I think these are going to be some of the things that from a staff perspective, we can, we have ideas. I think there's some direction that we can go with some of these things. So kind of getting back to, I gave you the number 4,106 units. in 2015, when we did this study, you'll see this was kind of the breakout of what we were looking at for each 2020, 2025, and 2030. It's kind of the top part of the table there. But I want to really point out, if you take a look, for 4,106 units, you're looking at almost $803 million in investment. I think council, as you've kind of gone through your budget session very recently, you know that's not our budget. So you know we're not going to be tackling that head on with our municipal budget and addressing it completely from a municipal side of things. And so I think what's good is to see that number from a viewpoint of how do we as a community involve the people that are going to be needed to get to, for instance, that number and potential cost to actually get these units on, through things like public-private partnerships, looking for funding, state and federal options, potentially changing regulations at the state level, such as for tax increment financing. But I also want to kind of point out the table in the bottom. If you take a look, I've provided you new single-family residential permits that have come through the city's offices, new multifamily permits, and then kind of remodels that we received over the last since 2013, so a couple years before the study. And what I'm going to point out is up to 2020, so from 2013 to 2020, we've added 451 single-family units into the city. If you look at the table above, we needed 640 owner-occupied single-family units. That doesn't include our 898 rental units that we needed, in addition to those 451 that we have there. Add the 69 multifamily units, you can kind of see that we're definitely behind. And so to say as a community to look at these numbers, I think this is just helps us put into perspective kind of where we stand based upon what's really happening right now. So, and I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Janine. I think she's going to take the next set of slides here.
Thanks, Derek. So basically, if we do the math, council, that Derek just gave us, even with the new single family that had been created from 2013 to 2014, and the new multifamily created in that same time frame, we're behind, you would say, by 189 single-family homes and potentially 600 and some multifamily units. That's pretty significant. Of course, that 2015 data is a little bit old, right? It's like six years old, going on 7 years old now. But I think you'll see as we move.
Janine,
yes.
Sorry, simply because you just touched on it. I know you're on a roll here, but that baseline data, you just referenced it. So it was set in 2015, and these growth patterns that all of this was projected out from come from that 2015 data, which very well could have changed given growth trends. Derek mentioned the rate of growth in the Rocky Mountain West being the fastest region, I think, in the United States. So all of that could be behind the times at this point, but it's what we had to work with, and it's when we did our studies. Is that an accurate understanding for council?
Absolutely. I think that's exactly what I was going to say, Mayor, and I appreciate that. So we look at that, and as Derek said, the 2015 study is data heavy, and it's an amazing read if you really, put the time in and dedicate yourself to it. But the question that we're always asking ourselves is the data current, right? It's 6 years old. So we're going to look at the more recent data as we move forward in time in this presentation. And so we're going to move on now to our economic development plan, which is a more recent look at housing needs in the community. We, of course, did I've phrased it here on the slide as the Greater Laramie Area Plan. I think it's important that we reiterate for the council and the public that this plan was a joint collaboration of all kinds of agencies, but notably the city and the county. And our intent was to create an economic development plan that wasn't Laramie-centric or just specific to our town, but to be specific to the Greater Laramie area and looking broadly at the city and the county. And that makes sense for us, right? Because we're a county that really only has one large, urban area, and that, of course, is Laramie. We looked at housing for the reason that Derek said. Our former employee, Sarah Reese, used to always say, well, if you think about our effort to create jobs, those jobs have to have a place to rest their head at night, and that's why housing matters. And so the Thrive Economic Development Plan took a look at housing. It revisited the 2015 plan and kind of refreshed it based on the most recent census data, which at the time was 2017. In addition to our own local Greater Laramie Area Economic Development Plan, that same year, the Wyoming Business Council did a workforce housing assessment for every county in Wyoming, so for all 23 counties. And so it was really fortuitous that those two data sets came to us roughly in about the same time. So these next slides will look at those two sets of data, the states and ours. And I want to start off by sort of getting your mind thinking about the two principles that I put forward on this slide, because I do firmly believe that these two things are true based on what we saw in the Thrive Plan and the Business Council's plan. First principle is our housing problem is not caused, and if it's not caused by, then it can neither be solved by simply using or regulating physical space differently. Basically, what city codes do, and I'm referring to vertical space, building up off the ground, and also horizontal space, lot sizes and setbacks and things like that. And I do often speak with folks in the community who will point to city codes as the culprit, so to speak. But Derek is right. There is no silver bullet, and our city code is not a silver bullet, although it can be contributing, certainly, to addressing and fixing our housing problem or to making it worse. Then the second principle I wanted to point out, and to me this was a huge takeaway when we looked at our economic data deeply. And this is something that we purposefully asked Fourth Economy, our consultant on the Thrive Plan, to do. We said, we want you to look at our economic data, and we want you to tell us, are we a low-income community because of our student population? And of course, that's what I was always told long before I lived in Laramie, just being a Wyoming native. I've lived here now 25, 30 years, and everybody always says that our housing problem is because we're a community which is full of college students, and that it makes our, median incomes low, and that it's just inevitable for that to happen to us. But I would assert to you, I don't believe that's true after we looked at the data with Fourth Economy. Our housing problem is not an outgrowth of being a college town. It's not inevitable, and it isn't being driven purely by the demographics and income trends that students bring to a college community. So the next slide, we'll look at that data a little bit more. So the top parts of this slide are data compiled by the Wyoming Business Council. They told us that we have the least affordable housing of all 23 counties in Wyoming, which was really interesting. They also told us we had the 10th oldest housing stock of the 23 counties, with 55% of our housing built before 1980. And then the green point is what we really asked Fourth Economy to do when we said do this deep dive into our economic data and our wage data. And what they found is that our home value to income ratio in Laramie is really more similar to Colorado and doesn't look like Wyoming much at all. So the assumption that we've all had for years is, well, our student population explains a high poverty rate and the need for inexpensive housing. And that's a quote from a state publication. But the reality, when we dived into this data, and the next quote is from our Thrive Plan, is that low median household income is persistent across every age group in this town, and especially so in our prime working age individuals, 25 to 44 years old. These are our young professionals that all of the employers in town tell me they have a hard time once they recruit and get that talent. They have a really hard time keeping that talent, because when these kids want to put down roots, and many of you here and myself included have been in our 30s wanting to put down roots, wanting to buy a home that we feel is suitable to raising a family, and really finding that it's not really possible to do that because our average home prices are high. And here you see the data from the Thrive Plan. In Laramie, 25 to 44-year-olds making about $53,000 a year, compared to Cheyenne and Fort Collins, where their wages are really $20,000 higher. So I thought this was just so illuminating when Fourth Economy really did that deep dive for us. The next thing you would ask yourself is over here on the right-hand side, well, where are these folks working, or where are they not working, and why does that matter? Well, we have, of course, educational services really being heavily populated in our workforce. We're 21% above the national average as far as people working in educational services. And then we're also 4% above the national average for accommodation and food service. So this is where a lot of these people are working. But I'll tell you where they're not working, which would be useful to Laramie, of course, is they're not working in traded sectors and manufacturing, where we're 8% below that national average in terms of the number of people working in that sector. So that kind of tells you where they're working, but that 25 to 44-year-old number is striking, excuse me, but don't lose sight either that the 45 to 65-year-old median household income is also lagging. It's a little more comparable, but certainly lagging behind Fort Collins, and the 65 and older wages lag as well. The thing to know when you look at the home-to-income ratio, we mirror exactly Fort Collins based on the 2017 census data, coming in, I think, at actually, we were slightly higher. I apologize. Our home-to-income ratio was 4.9. Fort Collins was 4.7, and Cheyenne was 3.2. So you can see we really look a lot more like Fort Collins when it comes to the amount people pay for homes compared to their income. So next slide. This is the particular section from our economic development plan where we looked at housing, and it ended up being focus area 6 out of 6 focus areas in the entire plan. And there was a notable statement that we need to expand the quantity of housing available. They said we are losing workers. We know this from talking to our employers in town early in their careers due to that home value to income ratio. And that is, Derek said it earlier, it's a foundational barrier to business readiness and to recruiting talent. We like to focus a lot on, well, if we just had more houses to sell. But what we heard in the community survey that we did as part of Thrive is quantity and supply is part of the problem, but quality is a really big problem too. And that probably comes back to the fact that our housing stock is, 55% of it built prior to 1980. This also, next slide, is from the Laramie Economic Development Plan, and these are the specific goals that were identified. The need to increase the volume of construction, enhance quality and diversity of housing stock. Diversity is the same phrase that Derek used earlier when he talked about housing typologies. So maybe not just single-family homes, but looking at different types of homes, particularly some of the smaller homes that are really in demand across the country due to changing demographics. Laramie also experiencing that change in demographics. With respect to the city's role, it was noted here that we would look at our code development and also our code enforcement side, and we could do better there as a municipal government. There was a note in the plan that we should be increasing financing options that are available through public-private partnership opportunities. Number 3, we could work to increase the pipeline of developers and laborers. And then 4th, identify opportunities for infill development in strategic locations. On this slide, like in the previous, we've highlighted in green things that have or are happening. As you know, we address the code frequently, make revisions there to try to make the code more friendly to developers. I went ahead and highlighted increasing the pipeline of developers because I know that your planning staff, Derek and Matthew, they are talking constantly to developers and trying to entice people to come and build more housing in Laramie as they just conduct the normal course of their activities every day. And then identifying opportunities for infill development. As you know, we're looking at North 4th Street where the municipality might be repurposing some land. But certainly there are many other things that we could be doing beyond what we've done so far. Next slide. I just want to, so before we move on to this section, the 2020 housing strategy, I just want to ask if there's any questions about the Thrive Plan or the Wyoming Business Council data that I just covered.
I have to cycle through the video feeds here to see if anybody is raising a hand. So I would encourage you not to be shy. This is our work session. Yeah, thank you. I see Councilor O'Doherty with somebody else, and then I'll go to Councilor Harrington. Sorry, I can't see all of you at once because we're looking at the slideshow. So Councilor O'Doherty, please, thank you.
Would this tell you there are 2,000 homeless families in Laramie if we didn't meet this, or there 1,000 or something? I don't think we have that many. So, so that this, where are people living if there aren't houses? They're just not moving here, or the people that are here don't have a place to live?
Thank you, Councillor O'Doherty. That is a great question. And so from my perspective, I would invite Derek or anyone else who'd like to weigh in. But I am told often by our employers that we are unable to recruit talent. I think we heard from LEDC last month that they are having a hard time recruiting businesses. And so I think the answer, undoubtedly, there are homeless people in our community. But I think the answer is, and what our Thrive Economic Development Plan was trying to tell us is, you are losing opportunities because you don't have housing. You're losing businesses coming to town because they don't have anywhere to put their workers. And you're losing people who want to move to Laramie who ultimately say, I can't afford it here. Maybe I'll go next door to Cheyenne where that house to income ratio is 3.2. I can tell you I've had also personal conversations with businesses that we did successfully recruit to Laramie. Tungsten, High-Vis, some of those employers. And I know from personal conversations with their CEOs that they ultimately had a hard time recruiting workers once they got here and had to pay housing stipends, I guess you would say, to help those folks to keep them here, because they were surprised, frankly, by the lack of housing and the unaffordability of it mainly.
Councillor O'Doherty. Oh, please, Derek. Yeah.
Yeah, let me, excuse me, let me add into that too is, as Janine mentioned, we're losing opportunity. These numbers are based on growth rates, projections of what we should anticipate as a community. And remember, we're using these numbers to build out our water systems, build out our sewer systems, do all the things that all the rest of our city staff focuses their time on. And what we also see in our community, and we see in other communities that have a poor housing health, is people within the community start making compromises. They, instead of being a young professional and finally living by yourself, you're compromising living with a roommate or two or three. Maybe you're choosing a poor quality home in order to afford something. Potentially you're maybe taking a quality of life compromise. So for instance, maybe you're living further away from where you desire to live, or maybe you're commuting even potentially. I mean, who knows? Maybe you live in Cheyenne and start work, commute over here. You start spending less money in your community. There's a lot of other ways in which people will still try to afford housing or make the housing work for them. But usually it's not ideal. It's usually not what their real preference is. And I say what their preference is, and I'm not talking about this idea that everyone should live in the exact same type of housing, but what someone should expect within their profession or their time of life or things like that. There really is, sometimes they're making many compromises for it. And so that's we're seeing that generally. So.
Thanks, Derek. And Council, that is what our Thrive Plan said. They said we have an unusually high number of people who are spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And like Derek said, they're making the choices that he said, but what strikes me about it is when you're spending 50% of your income on housing, whether that's owning or renting is irrelevant, but when you're spending that much, when you're spending well above what is considered normal and financially appropriate, then what you're not doing is you're not probably spending money at local businesses, right? And so it all ties together in this circle, and that is, I think, in that slide 4, what we were trying to kind of demonstrate is how housing is just the heart and soul, really, of our local economy, and having a good health of housing versus not is going to affect everything else.
Thank you both. Councillor O'Doherty, any follow-up to that?
No, thanks.
All right. Councillor Harrington, I know you wanted to ask some questions, and then I'll go to Councillor Stalder.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Mayor. I'm curious if we can point to anything in 2016, city or otherwise, looking at that chart, it was several slides back, but that showed the number of permits applied for in every housing type. To me, like the single family homes is sort of all over the place for new build single family homes. And that, that has ticked back up in the last 2 years, but when you look sort of across the rest of those, they all fall off pretty dramatically. When you think about, while 300 to 200 may not be that significant, that's 100 homes that haven't been renovated that we potentially could have expected to be. And I'm curious if we can point to anything internally at the city or nationwide, just from you all's perspective as people who have paid attention to all of these issues for that long of a period in detail, if you have anything that you would point to that may explain that drop.
Derek, you're welcome to add as you would like. But Councillor Harrington, to your question, those years, roughly 2017, 18, we saw a little bit of a downturn in the state economy. I think we saw less building activity in those years, although, as you noted, it's not much less, but it's a little bit less. And those are my kind of initial thoughts. And Derek, you're welcome to add anything you'd like.
Yeah, Member Harrington, I think it's a good observation in that 2015, and then I'm going to group 2016 in there, and especially with the multifamily. That happened to be the time frame in which we saw a few of our large student housing projects come online in Laramie. We hit the sweet spot, and our office got multiple calls from multiple, student housing companies looking at Laramie, because we finally hit whatever that golden number was, whatever that golden information was for them. And we had a lot of interest, and we had some of our new student housing come in. We also had smaller projects come in that same time for that exact same reason. Market appeared to be ripe for that type of housing, and that's what we saw during kind of those 2 years. And then Janine's right on. We saw that turn down in the economy, and I mean it ground to a halt. And so that's my real quick, really quick kind of recalling what was going on about that time. So
yeah, thank you both. I know that's kind of a hard question to answer on the fly, and I asked you to speculate quite a bit there, but I do appreciate it. And I'm curious if we can keep an eye on this number, particularly the residential remodels. I think that would be a good marker for, as we watch the contractor licensing that we passed a few months ago, as we watch that phase in. I think this would be a good marker as to whether we're either watching work that wasn't permitted before but should have been, whether we're seeing that come online, or whether we're seeing a decrease in those remodels. I think that'll be worth paying attention to.
Okay, good question. Other questions? Councillor Stalder is up next, and then I'll go back to Councillor O'Doherty unless there's anybody in line ahead of her that hasn't spoken yet. That's going to be Councillor Schuster, and then Councillor Gabriel. So let's go to Councillor Stalder.
Thank you, Mayor. Mr. Tini, you made a comment about mobile home parks, and it just kind of made me wonder. I know before my time on council, there were some regulations on mobile home parks, and I remember several of them having to close, or I knew of people having to move their trailers and that kind of thing. And while that's not certainly like everyone's ideal housing, unfortunately, mobile homes are really kind of what is affordable housing in Laramie. And I just wondered if you could maybe fill me in on a little bit of what happened there. And well, I think it's certainly important to have, numbering properly for law enforcement and stuff like that. That might be a place where city code, in terms of weeds and what we want it to look like, actually put people out of affordable housing. And I'm not super in tune with what happened then, but maybe you could just fill me in on a little bit of the what happened with mobile homes. I have a brief recollection of it. Thank you.
yeah, so there was about, and I'm trying to recall the exact, I want to say like kind of 2013, 2014-ish time frame. We actually had a couple mobile home parks within our community. One of them just sticks out because I was really involved in some of the process related to it, which is where the Holiday Inn is located right now on 30th Street. We had some mobile home parks at the time close for different reasons, circumstantial reasons. being sold off to other developers and things like that. And so, you know, that was really the last time we saw mobile home parks completely close. But with that, you're completely correct. What we had is we had 50, I think it was 55 residents within like that one mobile home park alone that essentially had to relocate. And so if you think about that just in raw numbers, that means 55 people had to find new places to live. And it wasn't going to be in that mobile home that they had. Many of the mobile homes at that time in that park specifically happened to be older than the HUD permitted home that's permitted within the city. So we only permit homes that are constructed under a certain level of quality and inspected by the HUD agency. And what that meant is some of those homes were so old that they couldn't be relocated back in the city. There were some that did go into some new mobile home park that was being built at the time, and then also some of the existing. Following, like I said, kind of the 2015 plan, one of the directions from the 2015 housing study was upgrading the quality of some of our mobile home parks. And so that is where council did adopt some regulations that I would call them pretty basic health safety standards when it comes to the mobile homes within the park, controlling of some trash, junk vehicles, weeds, making sure units are skirted, making sure any type of like life safety issues are addressed within a mobile home park. For instance, during our first rounds of inspections, we found some pretty unsafe conditions just like physically on the site, like wells that like holes that were opened up where kids could just fall in them, just things like that needed to be addressed so that those parks could be safe. If you take a look at those regulations, they're fairly basic. They didn't require road upgrades. They didn't require, certain fencing or anything like that. It was fairly basic, I would say, standard of living type things that were brought into requirement. And so the other thing too that I would just point out is that, mobile home parks are definitely a component of housing within every community, and they're probably not gonna go away. And I think from a perspective of, at least from like staff's perspective, I mean, we have ways in which we can permit new mobile home parks, but what's interesting is we don't often see those coming into the community, probably for more economic reasons. The reality is that the economics of housing, whether it's multifamily, single family, or a mobile home park, drive whether these business people build these things. And so I think it's, to say that mobile home parks don't provide some sort of housing component to our community isn't genuine, but it plays also an essential role in some of our housing stock in our community.
Derek, we haven't had a new mobile manufactured home community application in at least 6 years?
It's close. I think the last one was like 2013, 2000, right in there. I mean, like we're almost on. Yeah, I mean, it's been a while, and we don't even get interest in them. People are not contacting our office about it. They want to build multifamily housing is more what they would prefer to build.
If I can, Councillor Stalder, I'd like to add a little bit of council perspective in answer to your question. I was on council at the time, the time frame referenced here with regard to proposals for mobile home parks. And one thing I can tell you is that the council modified or didn't even include some of the proposals that came forward from the work done in Derek's office. Some of the proposed changes and regulations that were proposed were rejected by the council, primarily because of the concern around the lack of available affordable housing and available low-income housing. There were proposals put forward to set some age requirements for mobile homes, and whether or not those could be continue to be functioning in mobile home parks. And what in fact the council did was said, yeah, we're not going to put age restrictions on homes because we have too much of an affordable housing concern. So those changes were rejected. There were also some proposals about what we might do with what we might call camper trailers, which many people are investing large sums of money into and setting up as their primary residence in mobile home parks. And there was a great deal of debate and conversation about whether or not those should be allowed to continue in that way, and they have been. And that was another proposal that was rejected by the council in terms of the change. And a lot of those decisions were made on the basis of one, again, that concern about affordable housing, and two, feedback from the public. So the biggest changes that were proposed from a housing perspective at that time, the council didn't move forward with. I think what you heard from Derek and what I would confirm for you is one of the largest movers for a reduction in mobile home availability in Laramie has been due to private sector activity as opposed to regulatory activity from the city. You saw the Holiday Inn expansion and the University Plaza activity up there eliminating a large mobile home park off of Grand Avenue a number of years ago. Then you also saw the KOA campground make some changes and also eliminate some of that housing stock. So some of the largest reductions in the mobile home availability and the low income housing that provides have come out of the private sector as opposed to regulatory action. That's just something I would add there too. We talked about it and then we thought it's not really something that the council can do. At the time, we felt like it wasn't really something the council could do because it would reduce the housing stock at a certain price point for people, which is the opposite, as I think probably is becoming clear to all of us, of what we need to be doing. My 2 cents on that, just because I happen to be there for some of those, all of those conversations.
Thank you. I appreciate the historical perspective and the feedback on both. It sounds like that's great. Thank you.
I had Councilor Schuster up. Thanks for your patience, Councilor Schuster.
Thank you. You took half my thunder, though. I was going to talk a little bit about that. I know several people that have bought very, very nice campers with slide outs and everything. And yes, they are using them as their primary residence. Just like you said, we had many things happen. One of the wildest statements on that, on homeless, if you live in a camper trailer, even though you may have spent $65,000 on that trailer, you are considered homeless. I have a relation that's a pipeline welder. Even though he owns a house here in town, he's out on a job now. He is considered homeless since he is living in his camper trailer. If a person sleeps on your sofa or your spare bedroom that is not related to you, you are considered homeless. The homeless study is a little bit skewed because of some of the statements they have in it. The other thing is right now I'm in a group of people that are not releasing lots for sale because of the sewer problem on rentals. And once it is increased the sewer capacity on rentals, it will increase the value of the property. So they have decided to hold on to that property. And then also trying to find a contractor in this town is really tough. And it has nothing to do with us licensing contractors. There is just plain a contractor shortage in this town. It is tough to get somebody to come out and work. That's about all my 2 cents, because like I said, Mayor Paul Weaver, he talked a lot about some of the stuff that I had already wanted to talk about. And lumber right now has went absolutely ridiculous. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Schuster. I didn't mean to do that to you. It's just that it
Okay.
came up to the top of my mind, and then you added some things to it there as well. But this is a really complex and interrelated set of issues. Councilor Gabriel, thank you for waiting. You go ahead, please.
Thanks, Mayor. Appreciate it. I just noticed the other day in my neighborhood, a couple of houses came on the market, 452 and 750,000. So when they come on the market, they say, "Whoa, there's a house for sale," but who can afford it? I was wondering, Derek or Janine, from your standpoint, I noticed that the Cheyenne Housing Authority is remodeling their office on North 3rd, and I was curious what their role is in this housing crisis in Laramie. What do they do for Laramie?
Yeah, I mean, Cheyenne Housing Authority is who someone within Laramie who needs housing assistance goes through in order to try to find that type of the housing assistance that they need, depending upon what it is. And so, they've got the name Cheyenne in that, but they work here in Laramie. They provide those services for our community. And, they do help out in terms of providing some of that federally funded financing to individuals who need some sort of housing assistance. And there's a lot of ways in which you can get housing assistance. So sometimes it's just funding, but other times it's certain types of voucher programs. Sometimes if you're disabled, for instance, you may be able to get other types of housing aid. And so I'm not going to dig too much into that right now, but they do provide that for our community, that assistance, and they help those individuals that do need that assistance. But they only can work with what they have in terms of the funding that they get, and a lot of times that it's either from the state or mostly the federal level. So.
And Councilor Gabriel, we're going to look a little bit in a couple slides down at what the affordable housing standards are under HUD, and that would apply to the Cheyenne Housing Authority and their work here in Laramie.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Councilor Gabriel. And, you pointed out something that also we've already heard in the report and seen from some of the past data that we've received. Those price points are just, they're far and away from what we have been told by our outside people are what we need and what people are looking for here, especially in relation to the salaries that the local economy is providing. It seems out of balance. Other questions, input here. I know Councilor Doherty was waiting to ask a question for a second time, which is great. I just like to stick to that, letting people go in order. So go ahead, Councilor Doherty. Thank you for waiting.
I had a question about the metric about the renovations. Is that houses that were not on the market and now they are, or they they weren't being lived in and now they are? I don't really understand. What does that mean? If I just redo my kitchen, or does that mean I took a house that wasn't being used and remodeled it so it was usable? Thanks.
It's so that number there, Member O'Doherty, is any type of permit that's outside of building a full new home. So exactly like you said, might be remodeling your kitchen, a bathroom, might be adding a deck onto your property, doing typically some sort of house improvement that requires permits. And so that number definitely does not mean that number of units is coming online now because it's been remodeled. But what's important about that number, though, is that that's an improvement of our housing stock in some aspect or another. Now, some of those may be different, in terms of the scale of the work that they were doing. But, I think it's a good indication of what you're seeing in terms of people reinvesting in their property.
Thank you.
Council, everybody's doing a good job of asking a pretty broad range of questions here. Any others right now? Okay, I'm not seeing any hands up. I hope I haven't missed anybody. I'm looking again. All right. City Manager, probably good time to move on.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Mayor. So building on the 2015 big, deep data dive, and then building on the work that Thrive and the Wyoming Business Council did, the planning office largely drove this effort to do what I call kind of drill down on affordability of housing and choices of housing. And this is what we will call our 2020 housing strategy. This was the city working with community builders. It was a recommended outgrowth of both the 2015 plan and also of the Thrive plan. So this next slide, Council, is going to get directly to what, excuse me, Councilor Gabriel was just talking about, affordable housing. And Derek and I talked a lot about this slide. We think it's really important that we spend decent time on it to make sure that we are all understanding the difference between affordable housing and housing affordability, right? Which you would think those are the same, but the way we're using those terms, they are not the same. As we talk about the Cheyenne Housing Authority and the work they do, working with the HUD, Fed, and also and moving those federal funds coming from home down into the state and administering them within the state of Wyoming. There are standards set by the federal government, and you see those in the chart to your on the right-hand side of the slide, that determine or strive to make housing affordable for low-income individuals. So affordable housing is a category of its own. It is really subsidized homes built and administered to assist low-income persons with having housing available to them. AMI is the basis upon which the federal government determines what a household will need in terms of subsidy in order to allow them to live in a reasonable accommodation. So the sites and the buildings are all based on HUD standards. As we talked about, for instance, mobile homes, I had texted, I sent to the Council of Frequently Asked Questions via email that HUD publishes about what HUD will set, what mobile home or manufactured homes HUD will or will not subsidize. Of course, it's based on standards for construction. These federal and state HUD programs also pay for tax credit housing. We've seen some of that developed very recently in Laramie. We mentioned that earlier. The 55-plus housing unit to whom the city sold land at a reduced price, they were able to secure tax credits through the Wyoming Community Development Authority. That's all federal pass-through money that helps them to build that housing and to keep it affordable for 55-plus communities. We've also seen out on Beach Street a low-income housing structure built 4 or 5 years ago that the city collaborated on that built subsidized affordable housing for low-income individuals. You can see the standards over here. What I'll tell you as we move to the next section of housing affordability is, according to Wyoming Business Council study, a family who earns a family with 120% of the AMI, so folks who aren't even on this chart but are above that chart at 120%, are considered to have enough disposable income to have ample choice in what kind of housing they buy and ample quality. They can purchase quality housing. What the argument is with affordable housing for low income is that those folks would not be able to have choice, affordability, or quality housing were they not subsidized in those situations. The last thing I'll mention about affordable housing for low income individuals is that, as you know, the state of Wyoming just recently did pass some preemption legislation that is going to make it really difficult for cities to participate as a municipal government in subsidizing housing. So affordable housing is focused on low income. What we're going to talk about and what we have talked about thus far a lot is housing affordability, and this is really for working people, workforce housing for folks who likely are above 100% of AMI and don't qualify for subsidized housing for low-income persons. Workforce housing depends on that issue I talked about earlier, home value to income ratio. These are folks who can pay for housing, but in order for that housing to be affordable for them, the statistic says they shouldn't be spending more than 30% on mortgages or rent. And this is where Laramie has a real issue. Not that we don't have an issue for low-income individuals, but we know we have a problem with workforce housing because so many people working and supposedly making enough to afford a good home are paying way more than they should because our cost of house is high and income is low. So these are homes that are affordable by your working class folks to either build or own, maintain, remodel, rent, that sort of thing. I want to leave you with the data point at the bottom of this slide. According to the Thrive study, and this coincides and is confirmed as well by the state's data, The affordability metric for kind of your average person, right at 100% to 120% AMI, should be an owner-occupied home that is costing about $250,000 to $300,000. That's a single family, and then about $250,000 for a twin home. Last week on Thursday, when we were finishing this presentation, I looked up on the MLS how many houses in Laramie exist and are for sale right now at up to $300,000. And we had 8 homes that were $255,000 or less, and we had 2 more between $250,000 and $300,000. So not only is supply an issue, but I dare say if we had the opportunity to look at some of those, we may find that they aren't necessarily what folks are looking for when they're getting ready to, as young professionals, start a family, put down roots, etc. So I'll leave it here, but I think it's important we differentiate affordable housing for low-income individuals and housing affordability for your working folks. And I'll go on, but we will have a lot of time to come back to this, Council. So the 2020 housing strategy sought to drill down on affordability and choice. And it looked at housing affordability for workers, because this is where we're hearing we don't have enough. Derek's folks established 2 citizen advisory groups. We had this housing action team and then a housing council. We've noted those folks on this slide here. We want to send a big thank you to them. I think Derek called them the all-stars or the rock stars or something like that, but they were all very helpful folks from the private sector, representing realtors and financiers and all of those different perspectives to try to think about our housing issue and how we get to affordable housing for workers. There were multiple opportunities for stakeholders to comment, multiple public meetings with the development community. This gets to our builders, our subs, our financing folks trying to figure out how do we get more builders, how do we get more subs, because as Council Member Schuster said, if you don't have labor, you can't really build much, and that we know is a persistent issue in our community. And then these folks developed this housing roadmap based on case studies. They did a lot of market analysis and research, and ultimately provided some recommendations and suggested that we conduct a code audit. Next slide. So as we look at the affordability side of the work that they did, we found really what I take as like just more affirmation of the affordability problem that we have in Laramie. They found the average household has less income, the cost of housing is high, and there's a large affordability gap. And I see our little red circles a little bit off in that presentation, but not surprisingly, it's supposed to be circling Laramie, showing that at the time they did this study, and this is based on the 2017 census data, that the median home value was $210,000, median household income $45,816, and that home value to income ratio just really being so much similar to Colorado, not looking at all like Cheyenne, and certainly discouraging people from relocating to Laramie or choosing Laramie if they'd like to do so. And then also on affordability in the next slide, more affirmation yet again of the need to provide options for the missing middle. And this is a term that I suspect most of you have heard, but that missing middle is that affordable housing for working class individuals. And this is a slide where I'm going to kind of dump it off to Derek, and he's going to go to choice. But this slide kind of bridges the gap, and you can see the 3 multifamily sections in the middle, circled in green, and the 2020 strategy really said, wow, you should be looking at some more multifamily in this community in order to meet the needs of rental and also ownership that this missing middle might like. And so I'm going to transfer it to Derek. You're welcome to hit on this slide, and I think Derek's going to talk us through the next bit of the presentation.
Thanks, Janine. One thing I'd point out on this slide, and I think it just graphically represents what the desire as well is. If you take a look, when we talk multifamily, a lot of times we jump to this idea of a really large building that has a lot of units in it. But if you take a look at this figure, look where it's saying that the demand is at. The demand is in nothing more than buildings with 5 to 9 units. And what I think is important about that is scale. And when I talk about the scale, I think about how does it appropriately fit within our community. And a lot of times we hear how a large building or a larger multifamily project can impact a neighborhood, often in maybe a negative fashion. But what I like to point out is that when you start talking about some of these types of housing, or this typology of the missing middle, being maybe a duplex, a fourplex, a triplex, or maybe like a 5-unit, 9-unit building, a lot of times those fit much better within the context that we already have within our community. And I would really challenge you as a council, next time you're out for your evening, morning walk, or doing, just traveling through a portion of our town, really pay attention to what types of housing is really out there. And you're going to surprise yourself. You're going to find that in some of our neighborhoods that you may traditionally think are just single family neighborhoods, or maybe, there's a basement apartment around the corner, that really there's probably more than that. There's really probably a lot of these types of housing potentially intermixed through the neighborhood. So it's not uncommon. It's not something new to our community, but it is something that is needed in our community. It's something that people are desiring, and there really isn't a whole lot of that newly coming onto the market. And so when we started really looking at this information in the 2020 strategy for housing, was single family really wasn't the focus. We're finding out people that want to build single family, they're building it. We're not needing to provide too much impetus for people to go out and build the single family home for people. But what we are finding is that other types of housing, so this cottage, bungalow, or smaller homes, or this ADU, so it's just a smaller living arrangement, is really desired, but we really don't have that. Like I said, you'll see kind of that middle of the road here. It's not the big units. We're talking about the smaller stuff, is really what this plan seems to be gearing, and seems to be what the desire is.
Hey, Derek, can you hold on a second? I think we have a question from Councilor O'Doherty.
Yeah, could you go back one? It's not clear what this percentage is. This what you think we need, or this is what we have? What is this? These percentages are percentages of what?
This is a great question. This is our current makeup right now.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's just kind of showing that where the desire is, it's not making up a large percentage of our housing stock. And I would say, I've mentioned a few times the health of our housing. A more balanced a number here is what a community wants to usually see to have a good housing health. Usually your single family percentage is always going to typically be higher. It's almost always going to be the case. But you want a more balanced approach for the rest of these numbers here, and probably that single family percentage down a little bit. So.
Thank you.
Right.
And like I said, it's really, once again, kind of going towards being able to have more choice in your housing. One of the things that through the public process when we were developing this plan and talking with stakeholders is a lot of people they want a lot of different options. They want a palette of choices depending upon maybe the stage in their career or their age or their family makeup, in order to meet their housing needs, but also provide good quality of life and meet their needs in terms of maybe where they want to live and how they want to live and how much income they want to spend. And what we've kind of kept coming back to and hearing was this middle missing middle type of housing that was desired and is not available for those people to then have that as a choice. So what does that mean? Very briefly, is what that means is they either have to choose a single family home, which maybe isn't meeting all their needs. It might be price, it might be location, it might be it's too big or too small or something like that. Or they're having to go to a larger multifamily product in order to meet their needs as well. as the community, if we can provide some of those alternatives, we hopefully can meet their housing needs somewhere else, somewhere in the middle, so to speak. So one of the things through this project and through this plan is we really started taking a look at what are some ways in which we can potentially address this issue in our community. And as we started really digging into it, one of the discussions, and we knew would come early on, is do we have issues with our development code that are potentially preventing some of this missing middle housing? And then also, what are the real financing issues related, or the economic issues related to this missing middle housing? And I put these figures in here if you could want to take a look at them. They're found in the 2020 housing strategy, and I really would task you to go back and look at some of this information in here. And what it talks about is just some of the things that we have brought to you before. So for instance, parking and how it can affect multifamily projects by having too many parking requirements can really impact the price in which you potentially can rent or develop a project. But also on a more smaller scale, when it comes to using accessory units or additional apartments or buildings or units within your home or your residence to help you make your mortgage and help make your home maybe more affordable, especially in a market where we know right now rates are really high. Being able to maybe make a few $100s in income on a rental within your property could really help you afford and no longer be cost burdened when it comes to owning your own home. It's a way in which you can kind of bridge that gap in the meantime while you're bringing on housing stock. And so as we started really working on this when we started working through this plan, we knew we would want to do the code audit, and I'll have some slides a little bit later that kind of dig in on that discussion. We discussed how do we explore public-private partnerships to potentially get investment within our community to invest in these types of products and the types of housing that we really do need in our community. And then how do we use capital improvement plans or CIPs to really drive growth, to improve the ability for our development community to bring on those units in a completely kind of private manner, aside from the city providing that infrastructure needs for those developments. And so one of the real large tasks that we took on when we worked on this plan was the code audit. And I think it's good to provide some perspective and to be, I think, pretty transparent for a council. A lot of communities don't do this, and here's why. It's kind of exposing, right? It shows maybe areas in which your code is impacting your community. And I think from like my perspective as the planning manager and kind of being in charge of this portion, I think it's a good exercise, and it once again kind of goes back to why you see code changes come from our department and from our staff in general, is because we're always trying to make sure our codes are right sized for our community. We bring a lot of code amendments forward because we want to make sure that these things are doing what they're supposed to be doing and not just being unnecessary regulation within the community, because we really don't need that. We have enough things going on to try to deal with. This is one thing that you always want to be on top of. And so with this code audit, what we did take a look at is we looked at 3 zoning districts. We looked at our downtown commercial zoning district and our R2 zoning district and our R3 zoning district. And so why those zoning districts? These are the zoning districts in which we can allow density. These are our common areas in which you see different products and different types of units beyond the single family home. And so by focusing our code audit on this, we're really trying to get the most bang for the buck, right? We're trying to figure out if we make changes to our code, how do we see the most positive return on our time investment, our changes into code. And we'll point out this really wasn't single family oriented, this portion of the code audit. And it's probably not going to solve our housing problem either. Single family issues are not going to solve it. Now, I put the word yet there, and I want to point it out because I think the single family discussion and what we do in single family zoning districts is going to be a discussion that we're going to have as a community, and we're going to need to have because it is a component. Like we said, there's no silver bullet, but it's a component of our housing strategy. And so the other thing that we did is we kind of took some of our code changes that we were looking at through this code audit, and we applied them to properties that were in our community that we said, what could we do today, and what could we do if we made the code changes? And we just wanted to see how would this really actually come out in play in the real world if we actually were to develop this property. So what did we kind of find out through this analysis, through this code audit? Zoning codes matter. They're regulation. They affect how properties develop. We know that zoning codes can be a barrier to choice and housing affordability. Obviously, you restrict or you make requirements, it's going to affect how someone develops the property. And so through the code audit, we kind of came across what we called the red flags. What did we identify? So we found out that we like big lots. The idea of having a piece of property that's large with a house on it is what people are, what we have right now in terms of our community. It's what's available out there. We have large setbacks and dimensional standards that affect the types of housing that we can build and how much land we use within those lots. We have some provisions within our code that what it does is it essentially limits the types of housing that you put on a lot. Even if you maybe can have additional units on your property, it really restricts the type of unit that you put on. It might just be one building with 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 units in it. Some of the changes you'll see will give us flexibility and some options when it comes to that. We like our parking. We have excessive parking standards that really inhibit people from doing projects that are economically feasible. And we have building requirements related to height that do cause some problems. So with that, what I was gonna kind of talk about is just, we like the traditional. We like what we think of the traditional neighborhood family home, the quaint neighborhood idea. And that concept is kind of what we've seen in our community for a long time. And we really haven't pushed that discussion beyond that. And, that's really kind of what we hope to do today, is to gain some of that direction of where do we want to go after this? Are we going to stay with the Beaver Cleaver single family home, or are we going to look for something different? So what I'm gonna do is touch on the R2, R3, and downtown commercial zoning district changes. And as Janine mentioned, I think just these few slides could be a whole evening of discussion. These changes potentially will drastically change the way in which our neighborhoods look and function. I want to say don't take these changes lightly, but I think too, these changes are impactful and will provide us at least an opportunity to incorporate some of this different types of housing. And so what we've done is each section within the code audit that's available, it's available online too. So for any members of the public, you go to City of Laramie's webpage, there's a Thrive Housing section. All these documents and all this information is on those pages. And for each of these zoning districts, we just kind of did a comparison table. And what you'll see is in both the R2 and R3 zoning districts, you're going to see similar changes. So for instance, minimum lot area per principal building. What we're doing there is we're really going to a more true density-oriented development proposal. Right now, the way in which the code is written, it really restricts someone, for instance, in the R2 zoning district, even if they have the right square footage within the lot, to really only do a one building type development with multiple units in that building. What that does is it really restricts the ability of someone, for instance, doing a maybe still, let's say a lot today allows for 3 units on the property. In the future, what we hope is that instead of the 3 units just being in a triplex in one building, that maybe in the future with these changes, it may allow that person to do 3 small cottage homes on the same property, each individual, or maybe a duplex and 1 cottage home. It will provide flexibility in the housing types that they can provide. Looking at some of the minimum lot area per unit, this would reduce the lot sizes and the density that we would be permitting within these zoning districts. Reducing the lot size simply means smaller lots, less land cost, and hopefully what you would see is a return in that in terms of your housing product at a lower price point. Changing minimum lot widths and setbacks allows for developers to use more of the property, as well as use more creative, smaller lots to develop housing. And then also too, potentially building in permissions for a more traditional live-work arrangement, especially as COVID has come, we've seen many people working from their home. Right now under a code, there are provisions that allow for home offices, small businesses within residential areas, but this would allow for a little bit more openness in terms of that, and a little bit more flexibility in terms of more intense uses within our residential zoning district. One of the things I want to point out, though, and this was some analysis that myself and our planning intern conducted for us using GIS data and parcel data, is if you take a look at the pie chart over on the left-hand side, our current R2 zoning district is a zoning district that's supposed to allow for multifamily development, okay? But right now, what you're seeing is a majority of that development is only being used for single family. So 59% of those lots are being used for single family, and 33% of those are allowing duplexes on it. What does that mean? It means about 92% of your R2 zoning lots, which are meant for density, are being underutilized. We're not using them to how they were zoned. With the code changes, what you'll see is you're going to see a much more evenly distributed number. You're going to see the R2 zoning district now really no longer being focused on single family, but now being focused on being permitted more duplexes, triplexes, and 4 to 5 units in these within these areas. And remember, this is just based on the lot size and the density, how many units you can have per square footage. Between the two charts here that you see, it doesn't mean that the density is increasing. It's simply our codes are allowing the actual zoning district in which these lots exist to be used to the potential that they were intended for when they were created. Currently, our codes prohibit that. They truly restrict the amount of units that you can get within this zoning district. And we just felt this was a really good graphical representation to show kind of the underutilization of how these lots are being used currently under code and potentially with these changes. Going to our R3 zoning district, I'll tell you, our R3 zoning district isn't as affected by our codes we found. However, with similar changes to the principal building requirements and some of the square footage requirements, which you'll see the square footage is not changing. We're not recommending that change. What it does, though, is it does allow for developers to come up with more unique housing products and types instead of all the units being put into one building or 2 buildings on the site. Some of these changes may allow for maybe a cottage home development where it kind of looks and feels like a smaller kind of small home development, but really it's still just a multifamily product. You'll also see reductions in lot sizes, setback changes, as well as changes in some of our building heights. Most notably, potentially changing some of our accessory building heights to allow for units in those accessory buildings on the site, which is important. I'm going to kind of point out one thing that for both the R2 and R3 zoning districts, and kind of using something that is on both slides, which is the accessory dwelling units. And what I want to point out is through the changes that we saw through our code audit, it would open the door for people to build these accessory dwelling units. And what am I talking about when I say accessory dwelling units? I'm talking about what people often refer to as like a mother-in-law suite, or a apartment that's maybe above a garage in the backyard, or maybe it's even an individual unit in a back garage, or 2 units. These are units that are typically smaller in size, smaller in intensity to whatever the principal structure is or the principal use is on the property, but provides for additional dwelling on a property. And in the R2 and R3 zoning districts, these are already intended for multifamily. The anticipation is that these districts will and can have multiple units today. It's just this would provide for more options when it comes to adding in those multiple units. I'll also kind of use this opportunity as, remember when we're talking about the R2 and R3 zoning districts, we're not talking about single family zoning districts. And when we start talking about accessory dwelling units, single family zoning districts are another area in which this community may want to consider. Do we want to allow accessory units within the single family zoning districts within our community for people to do similar things that we're talking about in this R2 and R3 zoning district? And then finally, I kind of want to jump into the downtown commercial zoning district. And one thing I want to point out is, some of this may look really familiar. And you're going to remember that we've talked a lot about this, and actually we've done this now. We, as a council and through our meetings that we had related to some of the code changes for the downtown commercial zoning district, we took a look at the taller buildings. We addressed that need. We also looked at the minimum parking standards as well. And so really with the downtown commercial zoning district, we've really tackled this head on and made these changes already. And so what's important, though, and I want to point out about the downtown, is that we found through the housing study as well as the economic development plan that housing within our urban core and within our downtown is highly desired. And a mix of housing in that urban core is really desired, not only for all different types of income ranges, but also for different types of housing styles and needs. So everything from your young professional to your seasoned family, all the way up to your maybe senior housing. And so I think it's just important to point out that we're starting to take steps in the right direction based upon what we're seeing here. And I think really for council and for our planning commission and for our community is going to be, are we willing to start doing those things in some of our other zoning districts, and more specifically these R2 and R3 zoning districts? I think at this point, I was going to turn it back over to Janine to kind of bring us back together and kind of wrap up, I think, our conversation here.
So council, last slide, and we're really getting kind of to the meat, of the matter, if you will, and what you would like to see us bringing back to you on August 10th. That's our tentative date for the Part 2 housing work session. We want to see some feedback tonight, or we hope to have some feedback tonight about our focus area. And this takes us back to that slide that we spent a lot of time on. Do we want to concentrate or focus our areas in either workforce housing affordability or in low income affordable housing? Or do we want to kind of take a measured approach to both? I've noted kind of in green here, like we've done previously in the presentation, what we have done already, and we have been working with those private developers and the Wyoming Community Development Authority to support their tax credit applications, and we have seen an increase in affordable housing in the community. So what I would sort of recommend to you, I guess, is that our focus area can remain affordable housing for low-income individuals in the manner that we've approached it in the past 5 years. But perhaps we need to step up our focus on housing affordability for working individuals and for workforce. As Derek said, no golden bullet, no silver bullet is going to achieve either of these objectives or both of them. But it does seem to me that housing affordability for workforce is something that we can try some novel approaches to. So we wanted to get your feedback there. And then depending on the feedback to that first question, we would think as staff toward the second question, what is or are our preferred actions or strategies? We've noted a few here. There's 4 there. The 2 in green are things that staff either have or would recommend to you going forward. As you know, on the third bullet point, you also as a council have talked recently about taking steps or measures somehow to try to address the quality of rentals in town. How do we improve the quality of them? How do we contribute to the preservation of that quality if it exists now or if it is achieved? And then there's the question of city-driven actions and strategies versus privately driven or public-private partnerships, as noted in the first bullet point. So we were hoping to have a little discussion around this and maybe kind of gauge the feel of the council and your temperature so that we can prepare a work session on August 10th that will really get at what you think the greatest needs in the community are.
Thank you, City Manager. I saw Councilor Schuster with a hand up first to start this off.
Thank you. Just a couple things, and I don't need them right away, is I'm just going to pick on a house here, and we're just going to call it something out behind Walmart. That seems to be where they're loving to build right now. And we're going to pick on a $300,000 house. I would just kind of like to know some information. What does a house cost to hook up to our water, our sewer, building permits for $300,000 a house? And then I'd kind of like to know for the smaller street, the cost of the street per foot, which is curb, gutter, and sidewalk, because I know that the contractor is going to pass on every single one of these costs. So I just want to know what portion of the house costs for that. And I know what it is in some other communities because I've asked some other people, but I kind of want to know what it is in our community. So no rush on this. You can do it in August. You can send us all a personal email just so that I have what base costs are that is going to be owed besides the building of the actual structure. Thank you.
All right, Councilor Schuster, thank you. I've got Councilor Harrington that had a hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Went to unmute and just turned my camera off instead. So killing it over here. So the first thing is Councilor Schuster's question just prompted this in my mind, and then I have a second question. I'm curious if we could get some sort of estimate for what those fees might be, and the sort of infrastructure expectations from our neighboring communities as well. To me, that would be like rather than what do we require, what does Cheyenne and Fort Collins require as like the sort of like 2 cities that we're often comparing through this process? Are those the same things that are being required everywhere? Be curious to know that as one thing. And then I was just going to, just for the sake of providing some direction in how I would like to move forward. I think while there's certainly a need for housing at every level, I do feel like our maybe my feeling on the priority may be this housing affordability level, just to use the terms. I feel like that's the direction I would like for us to work. I think that's the direction the city maybe could have the most dynamic impact, sort of with the keeping in our lane idea. I think that's probably where we could be most effective. And then, of course, assisting in applications and grant funding and things like that for the lower income affordable housing. And then, I do like continuing with the partnerships to the best, the public-private to the best of our ability. I think that could be significant. And I I understand that that's kind of the case already in planning, that you all work with developers as they go through their processes to make things work. The accessory dwelling thing is something I think I would be particularly interested in seeing happen, especially given sort of like what is actually R2 and R3 zoned in the city of Laramie. I think that's a really appropriate thing to be looking into. It's sort of the neighborhoods people want to live in, as far as like proximity to the university, to downtown, to sort of like walkable and bikeable neighborhoods. I think that's a place we could use a little more density, and I think it's also an opportunity to drive some infill in those neighborhoods. And then I think the question I had is, given some of the historic lot sizing in Laramie, so for just an example, so I'm not picking on anyone but myself, I live in like 950 square foot house on a 4,300 square foot lot. If I don't know that there's necessarily space in general to add an accessory dwelling unit, but I'm curious what that looks like. If I do have a garage, if I decided to convert that, I ask because all of my neighbors live in very similar situations as far as lot size and house size, and all have very similar garages that are a great space to increase density. So I'm curious about that, and then maybe how we can, as another. I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor, I'm just going to keep piling on to the planner and city manager's lists here, but they're coming. So thanks everybody for being patient. But
that's why we're here, Councilor Harrington. Great. Keep it coming.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm curious how the city can use the land that we own, whether that be North Fourth or elsewhere, how we can most effectively use that. And I think maybe to drill down on that, how we can use it most effectively part, I'm curious how we can use that to sort of catalyze neighborhood character as we redevelop. So how we can utilize all of these code audits and proposed changes to really duplicate some sort of like neighborhood character that we see already in the city, whether that be, sort of West Side character or the Tree neighborhood as two like easily defined neighborhoods that I think people really enjoy living in and have a lot of pride in their neighborhood. How we can use the land that we own, North Fourth and otherwise, how we can utilize that to sort of shape the direction of the development in those neighborhoods, and really like shaping our code. So those would be some questions for maybe a future work session, but those are some things I'm interested in.
All right, Councilor Harrington, is that everything for now? Okay, we'll come back around. I'll talk about this until the housing problem is solved, although I doubt talking about it is going to get it done. Other questions? Other input? Yeah, Councilor Schuster. Yeah, then I'll go to the Vice Mayor. Councilor Schuster, you're up.
Okay.
Actually, Councilor Schuster, I'm sorry. I'm trying to stick to my rules. Why don't I go to the Vice Mayor and move back over to you? Vice Mayor?
Okay, thank you, Mayor. I'm just going to mostly have comments. And my first is there a way that we could model a what-if situation if the university required sophomores to live on campus in some of the new dormitories that they're proposing? I don't know if that's possible based on the data that we have, but I'd be a little curious as to know if we could potentially model out impact of that, if that were to ever be a decision. You occasionally hear rumblings on campus regarding that topic, but I'm not sure if it'll ever come to fruition, but I just thought I'd throw it out there for consideration. In terms of strategies, I agree with Councilor Harrington in terms of housing affordability, workforce. I think we need to focus on that, but certainly not shutting the door on affordable housing options. And the other thing is I feel like in terms of the rental quality improvement preservation issue, I'm wondering if we and this is maybe for the mayor, but I'm wondering if we form a committee of council members to potentially work with planning to somehow, have a kind of a few of us working on that, those that are interested on that topic. And I can't, that's a lot of work by August 10th, but it might be, it might be something to think about, as opposed to planning coming forward with rental quality improvements. I was thinking maybe we could work together on that topic. And then, and I don't mean this in a sarcastic at all, but I wonder, based on the previous council discussions we've had with DC zoning, I wonder if, I understand where we're wanting to go with the R2, 3 and DC zoning, but I wonder if they are appropriately zoned within the city. So, is all the current R2, should that all actually be R2? Same goes for R3 and DC. So I'm wondering, and maybe the answer is yes, and I don't know that it is, nor am I convinced that it is. And so maybe we need a high-level presentation on, yes, what we currently have as R2 should absolutely be R2, right? So, or R3 or DC. So I think before we move to modify R2, 3, and DC, I really want to know if it truly should be DC, R2, and R3. Does that make sense? Because I wasn't so sure about when we talked about the DC issue, about a month or 6 weeks or however long ago that was. So that's it for me. Thanks.
Thanks, Vice Mayor. Other council members for the first time here before I start making it around? All right, I'm gonna wait. I'm not gonna do that thing where you guys pop your hand up at the last minute, right as I move into the next person. All right, Councilor Schuster, go for it.
One quick one. I'd kind of like to know what the county's getting in permits. Just kind of on the same thing, because we always talk about the donut. I want to know how many houses are going to be built in the donut type thing. That's all. Just curiosity, because we're not just Laramie. It's like we said, we're the whole county and everything. And just kind of curious on what's going on out there.
Yeah, let me second that. I bet you everybody here would be curious to hear that information. And I bet we can get our hands on that.
Oh, it should be public record. I don't think there should be too much problem in that.
Oh, no, not at all. Not at all. I just think it's something that's relevant to the discussion. Councilor O'Doherty?
I'm hoping that if we bring things forward, that it is with several council members in a subcommittee, rather than having, like we did with the changes of parking, with all of the zones and all of the uses thrown at us at a meeting. It's too much to digest and to have an actual discussion. So I would like us to break this down and not just throw a bunch of changes at us without us getting to really digest the effects. And I have to bring this up before I forget. 5 foot setback from the front seems to conflict with all of our traffic stuff, because if you had buildings at 5 feet, say the one on Curtis and 3rd, that's not enough of a setback. So I hope we're working with the traffic folks to Thanks.
Sure. Thanks, Councilor Doherty. I've got 2 cents. I want to throw out a couple of these things too, since it sounds like that's what we're looking for, right, staff? I'll say this. I'm gonna echo what Councilor Doherty said. I think although this is going to be time consuming, I really think the one piece at a time on priorities approach for the housing affordability and affordable housing and issues addressing rentals, those are one piece at a time. I'm going to be wary, as I think you've heard other council members say, of large groups of code changes or omnibus code revision packages coming forward. I'm unlikely to support those. I think these need to be piece by piece, with some individualized work on each aspect of that. I don't know if everybody agrees with me, but I feel that way as a member of the council individually. That's very much the approach I'm inclined to take. Probably makes it more difficult in one respect, but it also makes it more manageable in another, I would hope. And I think that might actually get us towards changes being made on a shorter calendar. I would also like to see the focus, at least initially, be on the housing affordability question, more than some of the others. Although I think they're all pretty damn important, and they're all kind of competing for space at the top. I think what our Thrive plan, what our housing study, what our business council assessment have pointed us towards is that housing affordability piece for a certain type of housing. That said, I think there's probably some code revision, and I think that the presentation tonight illustrated that for us. That does lend itself towards maybe tackling that question. I think that's probably one of the harder ones, and that's because it's an issue everywhere. Tradespeople are in short supply, materials are in short supply, costs have increased, transportation's in a crunch. There's a big inventory problem, but it's also the one that we've been hearing about consistently for years. And I think getting a good group of possible approaches that the council and the city staff can consider is step one there. I like some of the ideas that I heard Councilor Harrington throw around. So for me, that's what I think the approach should be. And I'll also say this, we spent a lot of time talking about some different things that we could do, accessory buildings and things like that. And I'll be very, very blunt. I am not going to be extremely excited about encouraging more rent-seeking economic behavior in our local economy. I don't think that seems to match with what our data is telling us people are looking for, and is causing us some of the economic stunted economic growth. 49% of the housing is rental. 51.1% of the people here are renting. I don't think that is a college town situation. I don't think you can explain that all with the university situation. I think the presentation touched on that. I think it's more to do with the attractive nature of rental investment in the Laramie community. I think it has more to do with the lower average salaries, and I think it has more to do with the inventory problem than it does with the college population. So that's my take. I'd like to look at housing affordability. Like to see other council people chime in here for the first time if they haven't yet. Otherwise, I'm going to start going to people that we haven't heard from. So I'm going to go to Councilor Harrington, then we'll come back to anybody else. Councilor Harrington.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I think the first question, so I have two more things. The first question is, I'm just curious if we can consider building material requirement as part of this conversation as well. Not that I want to lower the aesthetic value of our new construction. I'm just curious if, and honestly, I don't know what the like using stone or things like that requirements are. I sure see a lot of it. So I can only imagine that is a requirement in most zoning types. But when you think back on sort of like other neighborhoods, like I mentioned before, many of those have one building material, though they do have some variation in sort of design and other elements that may be included that may be more affordable than using stone or the like. Curious if we could explore that. I don't know that I necessarily have a strong feeling one way or the other, just was something I was thinking about. And then the other one is a more practical matter to Councilor Doherty and the mayor's conversations about maybe how we might pace this out and bring these things forward. Talking about significant changes that will require probably considerable amounts of work by council. So, I think the idea of a committee of council members working with planning and potentially some members of the planning commission on this would be helpful. But I'm also curious what the council would think about adding more regular updates on this work to our work sessions, to having sort of sections of our work session dedicated. I don't want to force the planner to come every other Tuesday to a work session, but having, yeah, right. But having more regular updates, I think, so that we're not hearing this now, August 10th, and as the second time, and then the third time we talk about housing this year being when we're expected to be up to speed and voting on it. I think.
Councilor Harrington, can I just interject, because I think this is such a good point, and I saw Mr. Cheney kind of following this pretty closely. I think also that might help. I hope it might help our somewhat understaffed planning department pace this work out, as opposed to having big chunks of it prepared for council presentations and sort of just pace it out on regular updates. Sorry for that interjection, Councilor Harrington, but I like that idea, and that's one of the reasons I like that idea.
Cool.
Please continue.
Yeah, no problem, Mr. Mayor. And I think it paces out the work for council as well. We're all busy enough people collectively, council and staff. So the more we can spread this out over time, I think probably the less sort of shock you'll experience from our side of the Zoom call when these all come up. So I don't know if that's a practical thing or not. There are obviously nights that the work session is going to be too busy to add a 10-minute update on what you're working on in housing and how that might. I guess what I'm getting at is some way for council to sort of shift the conversation before it has been finalized in regards to housing policy. So I think whether that be through a committee or through more regular updates to council with a chance for some feedback or both, I think those are both good ideas.
Thanks, Councilor Harrington. Other council members for feedback? Again, I think you heard the staff saying they're eager to hear about a direction here, so that when we get to the next work session discussion that's focused on just this issue, they've given us some guidance. I think we're getting there, but now's the time to be talking and sharing. Councilor Doherty?
I asked the assessor's office what percentage or what the number of houses or dwellings that are owned or that have mailing addresses outside of the state. And it was a lot. So I'm worried about houses being bought by like hedge funds or just people just as investment things when, especially if they're out of state, because then they might not be following what's happening with their building. But when I've gotten postcards from people wanting to buy my house, and everybody I know has gotten them from people that aren't a real estate agent, as far as I could tell. They have very secretive addresses, like it's just a P.O. box, it's just a first name. There's no Laramie business associated with it, but they want to buy all the houses here. I'm concerned that could be driving up our affordability or making things more expensive. If people can come from states like California move to Laramie, have a lot of money and can buy up a lot of every house that comes up on the market. How is that affecting? And I don't know how in the world we could do anything about that, but I think it's something that we should be aware of, like how many houses in Laramie, if it's 11% of the dwellings, when I did the math, have ownership outside, or at least a mailing address outside of the state. I wonder how that compares to other places. How does that compare to Cheyenne or to Fort Collins? And that's something I could probably do that homework on my own, but I just want to throw that out there as a concern. Thanks.
Yeah, I love those postcards. Thank you, Councilor O'Doherty. Council members. City Manager and Mr. Teeny, and I'll go to you after this, Councilor Harrington. Thank you. Are you getting a picture here, or do we need to be more specific a little bit about some of these points that we're making and direction we want to go? I always feel like it's good to check there.
Yeah, Mayor, from my part, I feel like this is good direction. And I would tell the council as well, I know this is a lot to wrap our heads around. We expect to come back on August 10th, but if we need 2 or 3, or 4 work sessions, we can certainly do that. So I feel like this gives us some pretty good direction, and I'd let Derek jump in if he would like to seek more direction or clarity or whatnot. But I appreciate all the feedback.
Yeah, maybe he'd like a minute to take an Excedrin. Derek, are you getting what you need what you need, or would you like more specificity?
Mayor and council, I think we're doing good right now. For us, from a staff perspective, because there's so many directions we could take this, the conversation we're having is good and allows us to focus our future work sessions, like Janine mentioned, on some specific topics that I think are going to help then address some of the questions we're hearing, maybe some of the concerns, because like I said, we just simply don't have the time tonight to dig into, for instance, the R2 zoning changes. What's it really mean on the ground? How does that actually look? What might the code changes actually be? That then starts to allow council to build that knowledge base so that you guys can make good decisions and educated decisions and informed decisions, as we move forward. And also too, some of these things I feel like when we get done with this work session, will allow staff to kind of talk about, like, okay, how do we want to present these different options to council, and what, because what routes do we want to go related to some of these topics? So, because some of these topics are still pretty broad, but at least we're more focused. So that's good.
Well, okay. And the reason I stopped to check in is I want to make sure that you're getting more signal than noise. There are broad topics, and there are a lot of different directions they could go. So, Councilor Harrington, I know you had a hand up a little while ago to add some more, so please.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor, and thanks, Council, for humoring the endless spree of to-dos. I just wanted to add to maybe that last point first. That I think when we're I think I would start by saying I know we've all been potentially following the census numbers as those release, and while Wyoming may look bleak by comparison to our surrounding states, I think it's important to when we're talking about demand, I think it's important to note the sort of more urban areas of Wyoming are seeing a more average growth rate by comparison to those other states. I think Laramie is on par with South Dakota for a growth rate. So just as a random aside, and then I think if just for Derek's sense to your last point, Mr. Mayor, I feel like we had those code changes for downtown come through, particularly talking about the parking ones. And I think there was probably an assumption that we would go through as a council and amend each one at a time. But I think at a practical level, that would make for some of the most unbearable meetings that we could have as a council, of 50 amendments. And I think just at a practical level, that was really hard to grapple with. So I'm wondering how many, I guess, circling back to an earlier point, how much we can influence these things before they, through a committee or through the mayor or through smaller work sessions, how we can influence those things before they come to council to see if we can nudge them in a kinder direction. Mr. Mayor, I didn't think I was going to end up with what I said earlier. So I'm sorry for just duplicating. There we are.
No, Councilor Harrington, there's no need to apologize. That's why you're here. I've heard a couple of different good points from the same council members, and a few people have added into the other discussion, but this is such an extremely important work session. I'm going to start picking on people. Councilor Cumby, we haven't heard much from you in this conversation yet, so what would you add to this, and what would your staff direction be?
Well, the first thing that I'd like to say is that I agree that I would like to break this down into component perspectives so that we can develop strategies, because these are very important decisions that impact the city for a very long time, forever. And the second thing that I would like to say is I think about the average age of our home, and that I'm looking at it is 42 years, and that many of our homes in this area are older. And as a person that lives in a mid-century home, so I'm about 70-something years old, I can tell you that beside the mortgage and taxes and insurance, the upkeep on a older home is tremendous. And I think sometimes that your young professionals and young people trying to get into a first home, if their options are something that's already 42 years old, there is just it's hard for them to anticipate the upkeep and the cost of upkeep. So first of all, they may have to pay a higher price for a home to live in Laramie. They may not have been homeowners, and I'm going to get to a point with this. They may not have been homeowners, so they may not have that knowledge of what it takes to maintain an older home. So then what you begin to see is people getting into homes that are over their budget. They're 40% of their income, and they do not have the disposable income to maintain the house, and the houses begin to deteriorate, and then that reflects poorly on the community, and then it becomes the kind of community you don't want to live in because it looks like it's declining. It's in a state of decline. So I think that Mr. Teeny talked about like these cottage homes, and back in the 20s and 30s, there were the Craftsman bungalow homes, and those were designed to be starter homes. They had a typical design, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath. It's a typical design that you can see. They're lovely homes. And now in Fort Collins, they're going anywhere between $600,000 and $750,000 for a bungalow on Mountain Avenue. I should have held on to mine. But I think to have smaller, new starter homes that are not such a burden to maintain, that have smaller property, that is not such a burden to maintain, where a young family can move in, and where there are other homes similar to that, and we build community and neighborhoods. I think that that could be very attractive to young professionals. I don't think young professionals who are busy building a career necessarily want to come in and buy a 50-year-old house and have to do all of that work that's required or pay for that, plus try to get a career going. So my 2 points, I would like to break this down so that we can really look at long-term outcomes and impact. And I would like to think about that as we're looking at zoning and providing housing, that we're also thinking about not just here a house, there a house, house in the backyard, house, all of that, but that we're really trying to design and build little communities that would be attractive for young professionals and working people to move into. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councillor Cumby. And let me say that I think your concerns and my concerns are very closely mirrored, and I appreciate the way that you outlined that. I'd like to add that I think also some of those smaller bungalow type homes that have the smaller footprint, in addition to being attractive to young professional groups and young families with perhaps two working parents, I also think that that type of housing that you described is something that could be attractive to a retired person, a retired couple, for some of the exact same reasons with regard to upkeep and the time required. Other council members that we haven't heard as much from, I really want everybody to get the full Monty, if you will, here. Councillor Somerville, I know you have thoughts about this topic. I'd like to hear them. I bet you the staff and the rest of the council would too. She's not really here. We'll give her a chance. Councillor Gabriel, do you have anything else you want to add in? I thought your observation about price in that neighborhood, and I'm familiar with your neighborhood, and those are nice homes up there. I didn't know they were going for $1 million approximately.
Right. No, it's so complicated, and I think Derek and Janine have outlined all of the parameters that we would like to get over. No magic, talking about the magic bullet and all that. I've heard some really good discussion tonight, and some really good points from council members. It's a lot to do with contractors and the private market and lot availability, and it's such a complicated question that whatever council can do, I'm sure we're going to try and work towards that. But to really go in and say, okay, we've got the solution to all this, especially when you take a look at the entire country. I mean, this is just something that the entire country is looking at right now, and especially here in the Mountain West, that it's hard to get through and trying to figure out how we can really construct affordable housing. That's what we're all looking to do. One of the questions I had, and Derek, you can maybe address this later on, but I remember marking down 189 single-family homes that were really looking at Laramie right now is behind, and I'm just curious if we have 189 lots available. Is that within the city or within the county, city and county? And you can address that later on, but that was one of the questions I had too, that we're in deficit about 189 single-family homes. So anyway, good discussion. Just taking this all in, Mayor. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And, Council, a very specific reason for wanting to tease out further points is because the more we talk about it, then you think about those other questions. And because, as Councillor Harrington pointed out, and the city staff, we don't have just an endless amount of time, right? We have once a week meetings, work sessions. So I think the more that we can do with them, the better. So I'm reluctant to just wrap this up because I know there's more here. Councillor Cumby.
Another thing I was thinking about, I think that over the past couple years, we've seen a lot of zoning concerns in permit requests, etc., putting a lot of pressure on the east side of Laramie. And, many of these homes are going to be, your larger homes on large property, more estate quality. And I would just think that as the city has been moving strategically to develop the north side, preparing the water, preparing to begin to lay out the infrastructure for the north side, that if we could encourage community style development toward that north side, I think there's a great opportunity for us to come into less developed areas of the city where we could have a more comprehensive plan to build a neighborhood that might be of better service to working and young professionals. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
You bet, Councilor Cumbie. Staff, I don't know if you want to. That's a little bit of a new topic. I don't know if you have anything you want to share with Councilor Cumbie about that, or if you just want to incorporate it in your notes for the next time. That's fine too. Okay, sounds good. Councilor Stalder, see if you turn your camera on. Thank you. Why don't you go ahead?
Thank you. I didn't want to get called on unexpectedly, so I
would have done it to you eventually. But I'll say this: you made comments earlier in the meeting, so my annoying teacher-like habits, I admit that's what those are. You were still good for a little while. People that haven't said anything yet, Councilor Somerville, they're still going to have a chance. Please go ahead, Councilor Stalder.
Thank you. I think one thing that we haven't talked a lot about that it should be part of the discussion is infrastructure and what we're providing to developers. We can make as many changes to the zoning, or the code changes that we want, but we just recently turned down, I think, like 120 unit development. And I know there were other factors there. But that's a lot of units when we think about these numbers. And the reason for that was we were putting a huge onus on the developer to build a part of Bill Nye. So I want to make sure that we're coming to this conversation knowing that like the primary function of the city or a primary function of the city is to provide infrastructure. So when we're incentivizing developers or talking about that, I just think infrastructure should be a big part of the conversation, and it is to a large extent with the north side. But developers are really going to build what the market dictates. They want to make money, so whatever type of housing is popular, that's what they're going to build, and we need to make sure we're meeting them at a place where it's not a ton of added expense. So for me, that's my takeaway is we need to make sure that we're contributing everything we need to do for that to happen.
Yeah, it's a huge point, and it absolutely has to be part of the conversation. Other council members, I'll go back to you in a second, Councilor Cumbie. We might be getting close to the end here with council.
Mayor.
I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you, Councilor Somerville. I didn't know if you were there. Please.
Yep. No, I apologize. You would have had some comments from some much younger members of the community. If
that's always welcome. No, anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So in general, I think there's been a lot of good discussion tonight. Councilor Cumbie actually touched on something that I had been thinking on in reference to the R2 district. I currently live in one where the neighborhood is majority single family housing, but it's probably one of the more mixed use neighborhoods that we have. So I want to be careful of that in terms of how zoning areas are applied across the city, especially to the west, to make sure that we're still encouraging a good mix, an appropriate mix of zoning in all of those areas. And the other piece that I was going to just add is infrastructure in general, as Councilor Stalder mentioned, is really important. But I think we have to continue to remember some areas of the community don't have access to some of the amenities that make residential building more palatable, even if it is multifamily units, and whether that's access to trails, greenbelt, location of park vicinity, those types of things. I think we need to kind of keep that in mind and not try to focus too much on pushing one direction in the city per se.
Thank you, Councilor Somerville. Councilor Cumbie, I think you have another. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just had a question, and I don't know a lot about the business of building and construction, and so I'm just curious. I know often the price of a house is priced according to square foot, and I'm wondering if the profit return is better by building a large house than a smaller house. Is it building a smaller home actually more expensive per square foot, and adding on that square footage kind of reduces that cost per square foot of building? I'm just asking that question because I'm curious. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Cumbie, and I'll tell you, you bring up a good point about that. My layman's understanding of that, that's largely derived from previous council conversations, is you're exactly right. That is part of the issue, and it's tied into a lot of things. It's the infrastructure costs. It's also the cost for the lot to begin with, and it's also how it's done. Is it a custom home? Is it a home that's being built for someone specifically? Is it being built as part of a development with a group of homes around it? And there's all those factors. And then, as Councilor Schuster mentioned at the beginning, it's a cost of people to build the house. It's a cost of materials. And I don't speak from any expertise here. These are just things that I've derived listening carefully to conversations about housing development as a member of city council over the last several years, and even before that as a member of the planning commission. So there are factors that can make it more profitable, and it's my understanding, for developers just to be building larger price point homes one at a time. But it just like everything else in this conversation, it's not always that simple. But in general, I think your instincts are right. Vice Mayor Pierce, and I'm thinking we're getting towards the end of council conversation here, and I'll see if there's some public input, but I'll check with you.
In terms of if I have any more comments?
Yes, or your other impressions about this discussion, and maybe any follow up with staff about if we're doing what we need to.
Yeah, no, I think I'm good. I some of my takeaways, some of my notes basically say, wages are too low, housing prices are too high, and we need more bungalows and condos. I do like the conversation related to what Councilor Cumbie was saying and what Councilor Harrington mentioned about kind of that community or a building projects that have some character to them. And those were, the words that Councilor Cumbie and Councilor Harrington used. I think that's what, if I could dream for a day, that would be great if we could establish communities or communities of character. Maybe would be a way to describe that. I like what Councilor Somerville said, related to the discussion in terms of the zoning. And I think we need to take a real hard look at that, or maybe I personally just need to take a real hard look at that. The big picture for Laramie. But other than that, I think this is good. Absolutely support working, we've said it already, working groups or, bite-size, how we, chew this over. I think I like it to be bite-size as opposed to, a 25-page document. So I think planning already knows that about us as council in general. So that's it. That's it for me. This is an important topic, obviously. So hearing from everybody and and getting good community input along the way will be great. And I appreciate, all the hard work that's been done. So.
Yeah, thank you, Vice Mayor. No, that's exactly what I was looking for. And Council, the reason I'm being so excruciating about going back around with everybody is just I really want these conversations about this incredibly important topic to count. And so that you don't end up in that situation where later tonight you're like, oh, I should have asked that type of question, and it just doesn't come out. So I want to make sure that we're really thorough here, but I think we're there. And I hope that this has been useful for Mr. Teeny and the city manager. And I think what we'll, I've got something that's popped up on my screen that I'm not super sure what that is, but anyway, it says something's being shared from someone else's, from the main city screen. Oh, it's the Thrive Housing Plan link and then some email addresses. Okay, great. City Manager, yeah, please, I saw your hand.
Thanks, Mayor. I just, with that screen up, I thought it would be important to mention that if folks would like to review the data that we've covered tonight and understand the origins of much of this data, then this website is going to be a great place to start. I'd like to make a point based on a public comment received by email to note that the multifamily housing that is in fact being suggested is certainly not the creation of city staff, nor our preference. We are reacting to surveying done of our community, basically, of the residents who live here, and the housing task force, which was comprised of individuals who work every day in the housing industry as realtors, as financiers, etc. So with that in mind, I just think this website may be very informative to certain individuals so they can understand what the community is wanting and needing, and maybe dispel any rumors that somehow Derek and I are pushing a housing type that we prefer because it really has absolutely nothing to do with our opinion or preferences. Thank you. So, yep, look forward to talking to you guys again, and I really appreciate all this great dialogue and discussion tonight, Council. Thank you.
And I do regret that we don't have just all the time in the world for these, but I really wanted a well-rounded council discussion on that for the reasons that I've already stated. I would like to see if there's any public comment at this point. I do see we have a couple of attendees, and I regret that we weren't able to get to this earlier, but sometimes that's just the nature of these discussions, certainly not by design. I don't see any hands popping up. I see that we have some folks from some well-known folks who are familiar with city process there in the attendees, but I wanted to make sure that the opportunity was given. And I'm not seeing hands pop up, and certainly this won't be the only opportunity for public input and discussion about these a number of topics. I want to put this last little capper on it for me on this, which is that sometimes we get a little bit interchangeable with these terms about housing affordability, affordable housing, tax credit supported, housing for workforce development, incentivized housing. All of these things kind of fit into this way too big of an umbrella of housing. I think what I was trying to emphasize is, and I think the city manager and our planning director did this for us, but what we're talking about, I think a lot of what we're talking about tonight has been housing affordability across the board, from the single family home, people that are interested in buying the single family homes of a certain lot size, a certain number of bedrooms, the larger homes. Housing affordability in general seems to be the major issue that we've circled back to the most tonight. Certainly there are a lot of others, not so much producing a housing that is seeking to address a certain economic demographic, but just housing affordability in general, and particularly that issue of housing affordability that we've seen teased out in all the housing studies and the economic development work that says housing in these price ranges we're having trouble with, and it's also the housing that people are telling us they most would like to see available. And that does seem to fit in a narrower category than housing in general. And I think we've seen a lot of discussion come back around to that and all the different challenges that we face with that, from the the cost to develop in the city, to the availability of lots, to zoning and all of those things. So maybe that gives us an idea about where the next direction can go. And I'm seeing a lot of heads nodding. And so hopefully as a little bit of a capper that's working for people. Anybody else here before? I think we don't have a lot of other things to cover on the agenda tonight, given what month it is. And there is no meeting next Tuesday, so we don't have to do a review or anything. Anything else? Councillor Stalder, not picking on you. I did see that you turned your camera back on. Did you have something else you wanted to add? Okay. Just giving us the goodbye. I think, council members, that is where we're at now with our work session and with what we have on the agenda. We have had a good 2.5 hour discussion, and I think it was worthwhile. So let's have city council updates and comments just as quickly as you please. I bet you'd all like to, since we've already been here for 2.5 hours, and we'll go to non-agenda items for public comment. Updates, council. Don't have to have any, but I know some will have some. Yeah, Councilor Gabriel, please.
Thanks, Mayor. City County Working Group concentrating on aquifer protection met with the city attorney and the assistant county attorney on Friday. And our water specialist, Darren Parkin, in our earlier meetings said we needed to concentrate on an update for the Casper Aquifer Protection Plan. So we talked about that with County Commissioner Sue Ibera, along with the assistant county attorney. And so City Attorney Ball put together a little memo directed to David Gertz from County Planning and also to Darren from the city about drafting an RFQ to analyze the data collected about the aquifer since the cap was last updated. And from that analysis, advised the city and county about a revision of the cap. Cost sharing was talked about, and so hopefully the principals involved with city and county will get back to the group so we can review what's going on, send it back to the city and county for approval, and we can get moving on an update for the cap. Also attended the meeting yesterday for the Albany County Tourism Board. 2 members, Kathleen Bertolini and Brad Jackson, have served their maximum of 6 years on the tourism board. Great members. Kathleen and Brad were always there offering some great information to the tourism board. And so we sent those 2 individuals off. We will have 2 current members, Kaylee Holyfield and Paige Malmstrom, will be recommended to the council at our July 6th meeting. And yesterday, in case you missed it, 9 p.m. last night, 21 minutes past 9 o'clock, it was the 21st minute of the 21st hour of the 21st day of the 21st week of the 21st year of the 21st century. We missed it yesterday, but I thought I'd pass that along. That's it.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Thank you, Councilor Gabriel. I appreciate that. One of the things that council relies on is Councilor Gabriel for always having a meaningful council report, and also cool stuff like that. Other council updates, boards and liaison updates or comments. Yeah, Councilor Harrington.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Just a quick update from the Pilot Hill project. There is now a connection from the schoolyard section to the top of Pilot Hill. It's a little bit complicated. There's a few offshoots because of some sort of issues with the BLM section of land, but I think those are resolving slowly but surely. But in the meantime, there will be if you look at their future land use or trail map, no other word, the proposed trails, Trails 9 and 10 are ready to go. And there's just a few sections of sort of like 2-track road that you have to use to connect them at this point. There is a ribbon cutting on the 1st of July at 5:30 out there. And then sort of a symbolic cutting down the fence between the trail yard and the schoolyard and the Pilot Hill trails that the community can participate in as well, beyond sort of that ribbon cutting at the trailhead at the end of Willett Drive. And then on that July 1st day of particular interest, they are going to put the names of those 2 first trails out to the community to vote on. There are 3 proposed names for each trail, both 9 and 10, and the voting will start on the 1st and close the 3rd. So we will have those trails named straight away. So that's all I have for you, Mr. Mayor, but I thought that was of particular interest.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Councillor Cumby.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. An update from the Laramie Disabilities Board. We are continuing our preparation to participate in Pride Fest with the event. I just drew a blank on my word. But we've encountered a bit of a challenge in that a number of our members who had volunteered to help with the obstacle course have been called away for various reasons. So now we're down to me and Michaela. And so we're reaching out and trying to seek other volunteers because I've spoken with the people from Pride Fest and with Daniel, who is the chair, and they really think it's important and they would like to see us do this. They think it fits in with some of the themes of the intent of Pride Fest. And I have talked to Kim at Epson Center, and we're ready to, she's getting all of the equipment ready, and so we're ready to set up on Saturday, and Daniel is trying to help to recruit some volunteers, but I have not done this before, and so I'm not sure of the logistics of how it works. And so we're reaching out to try to find volunteers, and if any of you know anybody who might want to work with us, if they could contact either Jasmine at the city, who's been a tremendous help, and or to contact me, then we could use a little bit of help. But I'm hoping it'll come together and that we won't have to cancel that. But anyway, we're working on it, but as things often happen, it gets a little dicey toward the end.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Cumby. I'm going to bet that everybody heard that loud and clear and may have a few ideas of some help they can send your way. I can think of a couple of people or organizations.
Shoot me an email if you have any ideas or anybody you'd want me to call. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no, you bet, Councillor Cumby. Thank you for getting picked up and making sure that's going to happen. Okay, other updates. All right, any comments? Nope, Councillor O'Doherty.
I had some updates. So USAC met the urban systems, and that was just talking about reprioritizing. But since the money is so far out there, did we talk about this last week? I was trying to remember if that had already been reported. So not much happened there. And then the Traffic Commission met, and we have our new member, Melanie Arnett, who's really interested in some ideas for making Laramie more bicycle friendly, maybe having a couple streets that are primarily for bikes. And so she had some ideas she wants to bring forward. And then let's see, what was the other? I guess that was it I have comments, but that's it for my updates. Thanks.
Okay, Vice Mayor Pierce.
No council updates, but I do have a comment.
Well, go ahead and kick off comments.
You sure? Okay.
Yep. I think, does anybody have any update that we missed? I don't think so. And if you think of one, you can just add it in before we're done. Go ahead. Sorry, Vice Mayor.
Yeah, thanks. Actually, it's a combined comment, maybe two comments in there. Last couple of weeks ago, we talked about some traffic issues on 9th and Harney, and I certainly appreciate the city's effort, City Manager Jordan and LPD in terms of getting out there and really taking a look at that intersection. It seemed like every time I went through that intersection, there was a police officer going either in the same direction or the opposite direction for probably, I don't know, it's probably been 2 weeks now. So I know they were there, which kind of leads me to my next question is, and we're getting all these announcements like there's going to be a closure on 9th, there's a closure on 8th, there's a closure on 3rd, and we're having a fair amount of construction happening, and I'm wondering, and I suspect the answer is yes to all this, but how much of an impact is that on our response time for fire, ambulance, and police when we have potential closures on 3rd, 9th, and 15th, and how? I mean, I know we've adjusted in years in the past, but how do we adjust, and how do our public safety folks deal with that in the construction season? And because, I don't know, it was just maybe, not that it's the first time I've observed it, but we just seem to be extra busy this particular summer season. So that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. Yeah, I feel like I notice that every summer season, but it's a good question about how we keep pace with those things. I'm sorry, I don't know who was next. Comments, I think. Councilor O'Doherty.
I forgot. Traffic Commission, we talked a lot about Harney, but our city manager was already on the job. So the engineers were doing a traffic study, and the officers are aware. So that already took off. And then I forgot to mention the solar celebration at the rec center that happened on the 10th. Yeah, it was the 10th. Yeah, that was fun. And then I just wanted to, my comment is that I was at the landfill yesterday taking branches, and I just want to say how proud I am of our landfill management, how much of the green waste that's not going into the landfill has got to help us with our carbon emissions. I didn't know that horse manure was dumped there too. So I guess we already have some pretty good compost going. So I'm really proud that our staff is always way ahead in the management of solid waste. So I wanted to say thank you. And also I heard JR on the radio talking about don't wish cycle. I heard him on the pop station. So I appreciate that. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilor O'Doherty. Welcome, Zoom guests. Hello in TV land. Councilor Cumby, comments.
Just a comment. I also wanted to compliment the efficiency at the landfill, and I and several of my neighbors over the past 2 weeks have been working on our gardens madly and have been hauling this gorgeous compost and all of my gardens have fresh mulch, and it all came from the landfill. And we just did raised beds this year using the compost and materials from the landfill. And it was greatly appreciated and better quality than anything I could buy anywhere. Thank you.
Gorgeous compost. I got to tell you, that's really something. It doesn't start out that way, but eventually, it can end up pretty.
You can tell I'm a gardener when I say compost is gorgeous.
All right, folks. Anybody else have anything for us? Okay. Well, I really appreciate all of your time, council members. Let's check and see if we have any public comment on non-agenda items. I don't see any. I want to give a shout out to our attendees who really stuck it out here. I'll note that that's the Main Street director and a member of our planning commission. I hope there was some interesting information that came out of this work session for you. Okay. I don't see any other public comment. City clerk is here, and she is not telling me that anybody's tried to contact her with any public comment. So I believe we have reached the end of our work session. It was a lengthy one, but I think it was an important one. And I really appreciate all of the input and the time that you guys put into this, even though I feel like I kind of made you a little bit there towards the end. I don't regret it. And we'll close this, and we'll see y'all at the next meeting. Thank you very much.